I'm Renée. Both of them, I'm actually going to get you to introduce yourself a little bit more about your relationship with Gabor Maté and the book. But we're going to have a conversation now. And I'm going to, the questions that you ask, and I do hope you're going to ask lots of questions, will be thrown at us from the back of the room where the guys are looking at the questions. So we're not ignoring your questions. So do put them in, ask as many questions as you want, and we'll pose those to the guys. So let me start with you, Renée. Renée, you're a Rebel Book Club member, yes, right? And you saw this book come up on the list, and you went,
yes, I was so excited. Yeah, I'm so excited. I mean, it is a book that sadly I've reread again and again, and I've given copies to everyone I know that needs to read it because it was so powerful in my life many years ago, because the book is actually not recent. I mean, it's probably at least 10, 15 years old, right? So he's been around for a while saying these things, but I think he's now just getting the attention that he deserves.
And you've read that book 4 times?
At the time, I've probably read it a couple of times since then as well, at least passages, because as I said, I give it to everyone and it comes back a lot. Yeah. I
think that's really important, because if there's a book that speaks to you about a particular issue, then dipping back in is actually really important and really powerful. And Zav, tell me what happened when you saw this book come up on the list?
Oh, I loved it. I mean, I'm very happy whenever Gabor reaches sort of the public, because you can only get so much of it, right? There's so much information there. He's got 4 bestsellers, and they're all just wonderful, right? They're worth reading multiple times, as you have. Yeah.
And you've read it. Why? Because I've been very clear that my issue in life was about drinking too much. Yeah. What you picked up Gabor's book. What did it do for you?
Well, one, it just contextualizes the whole concept of addiction, right? I mean, one of the things he said very early on was that addictions aren't just based on alcohol or drugs. Right? I was heavily addicted to work, heavily addicted to exercise. And a lot of the literature that he has really helps you process and almost start to become aware and mindful of your own patterns.
Yeah. So it's really important to know that this book is really useful for you, whatever it is that you think might be the unhealthy behaviour that is affecting your life in a particular way. And it doesn't just have to be alcohol, it doesn't just have to be drugs, and we can come back onto that. And for you, what was the issue that you were struggling with when you picked up this book?
Compassion. Basically, like in a word, it was compassion. I unfortunately had a lot of people in my life that I loved who were addicted in various ways. And when I read that book, and particularly the page, and the people who have read it out there will know this, where he talks about his own addiction to classical music CDs and buying, I think it was $11,000 he spent on unopened classical music CDs, and how he was so skilled at explaining how that was not that different from doing heroin. I was blown away by that. And I really saw how I had been judgmental. I hadn't been very critical in my own views of what was going on in the world. And it kind of blew the doors open on so many relationships that had been frustrated to that point.
And I'm really interested in that judgment point, because if I come back, so it amazes me that you've both picked up this book, which at the very beginning talks about people whose lives are incredibly chaotic and affected by what we would know as Class A drugs and really heavy addictions. And as somebody who can at least relate to some of that, because alcohol was the thing that was an issue for me, I still opened up those first pages of the book, and I was really resistant and judgmental. This isn't a book for me. These aren't people like me. I wasn't chaotic like that. So this book is clearly not for me. And it took me a little bit to power through it. And you've got issues around work and exercise, and you've got issues, around that compassion and for people. So how did those opening chapters of the book feel for you when you read about people that weren't you, but for whom addiction has become a really big part of their only part of their lives? Did it not make you want to just run away?
Well, I guess I felt compassion just seep through the book, really, because I recognized my own behavior, and I also recognized behaviors of people that I love in what he was saying. And so in actual fact, it made me more thirsty to try and understand more. And he writes wonderfully, right? He almost contextualizes the whole addiction. It shows you about the drivers of it, what people are going through intimately, but also what they're experiencing in their lives. And it's a page turner as far as I'm concerned.
I think the way in which Gabor defines addiction because I understand the word is loaded, right? And it has so many implications, particularly in the Western society. It's a showstopper. And that's not really what the kind of context that we want to have this sort of conversation in, right? But I think when you really get under the word and you see how he defines it as sort of a substance or a process, or even a way of thinking. I mean, he defines addiction so broadly that you can start to see how it plays in almost everybody's life.
And I think that's a really key thing, because actually by the end of those first chapters where he shares some very big stories about people, and then talks about knowing that those people are never going to change their lives. They will be addicted to whichever substance their whole lives, but you still treat them as a person and still treat them as an individual. I managed to slap myself around the face a bit and say, I can't believe I was still othering people, when actually a lot of what their life is my life too. And it did make me draw back. And then when those following chapters came in, where he talks a lot more about what addiction is and how it can be many things, that's when I began to grow up and stop being a petulant child and not listen to the message I didn't want to hear. Yeah. How did that begin to affect you in terms of being able to think about the things that were dominant in your life and affecting your life?
I think changing people is also an addiction. Can be, right? Changing people, changing the world. I mean, for me, I worked a long time and still do really in trying to change the world, but I understood that there was an addiction to control behind that. There was an addiction to external validation behind that. There was an addiction to managing my life rather than accepting my life. And so it's subtle, right? But it's there. And I think if you're willing to look at the book from that perspective, what do I identify with? You can read it very differently.
Yeah. And what about you?
I think another point that I'd make is the fact that it's interesting to notice when one reaches for distractions. Right? Being present is actually quite uncomfortable for a lot of us, and so it's interesting to know, what is it that I'm doing, and be mindful of what I'm reaching for. Because it doesn't have to be alcohol. It doesn't have to be even exercise. It can be swiping and doing my 20 minutes on Facebook. It can be not being present with my partner. It can be all these things.
So let's unpick that a bit about the being present, because do you think many of the things that we do, and I guess I would say alcohol allowed me to forget that I couldn't change the world because it made me very stressed, allowed me to not be present in something that I couldn't control. Do you think we all fundamentally have this feeling of discomfort, and then we're all trying to distract ourselves in some way, and for some of us that tips over into something far more unhealthy?
Yeah, but again, I would say that workaholism is very unhealthy, right? You're missing out on your life, right? You're missing out on being able to be there with people that love you and that you love. Now, a personal story for me was, I'd just come out of an 8-year relationship, and I remember walking, and I remember being compelled to drink. And I'm not much of a drinker, but that tug really spoke to me. It actually scared me, because I knew that actually if I went down this hill, given that I was feeling so low, it would actually just continue. And so I actually was lucky enough to notice it early on, to not have to go down that route. And so really, as the book quite explains, is, the things that we reach for in addiction are coping mechanisms, right? There is something underlying that is uncomfortable. And if you compare it to your present moment and how comfortable you are in just leaving it be and experiencing present, it can tell you a lot of information.
And I guess that's why also this isn't just about drugs or alcohol. It could be the other things that you do in order to not be present. Correct. That are all socially acceptable. I mean, alcohol is socially acceptable, which is why it tends to be an issue for many of us. But, being on your phone, watching lots of TV are also socially acceptable.
It's presence, but it's also not feeling. It's anything that you do to not feel. And for some people, that's pain and deep trauma, which Gabor addresses, I think, in great detail, very beautifully. But for some people, it's also not wanting to feel joy, not wanting to feel the full expansiveness of life. I mean, it's a funny and ironic thing to say, but I think there is a deep fear that we often have around just the expansiveness of life, feeling everything. It's intense, right? And sometimes we'd rather do something to dull it. And that's what alcohol does.
But do you think, we need to find ways to switch off? And surely that's not so bad, to find ways to not be present, to not feel things. How do you know the difference between the fact that you're having a rest and you're switching off and you've sat and watched back to back, Battlestar Galactica, which I think is a very, good thing to do. What's the difference between that being a really good, relaxing thing to do and it being something that is distracting you from real life? How do you even understand how would you even begin to identify that was a problem?
Well, I'd say that there are two parts to it. One is, as he says, to classify something as an addiction, it starts to actually have detrimental impacts in your life. Right? And so when you start to think of, okay, what does this behavior, what does this habit actually do to my actual life? Is it positive or negative? And can I actually, if I wanted to, do I actually have free choice? Right? Could I stop myself from drinking if I was in a social event or not? Right? And so where's that agency? Another part of it, I would say, is, anyone that's in, even remotely close to their 30s have the benefit of time. Right? And so it might seem like it's only 5 minutes on Instagram, 5 minutes on Facebook, but a thought that gets cut too short and that you don't let fester means that you never get to build who you are in life. And so 10 years go by and you're always cut short to a 5-minute thought, and you never develop it. And so you never develop as a person. And so, on the one side, it's look at the impact that it's having that might be detrimental, but also then look at the opportunity cost of what you could actually end up having as a life.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because there's a view that the time you start drinking is the time when you stop emotionally developing. So 14, cider for me, and I'm from Somerset. So and actually, I very much feel that. I feel like most of my emotional development has been done in the last 8 years, and I'm learning quickly to deal with emotions. Gabor talks a lot about trauma in his book, and sometimes we think about trauma as a really big life experience, but it doesn't have to be. Do you think, do we have to deal with that trauma? Is that the thing that we really have to dig into?
Well, dig into it, no. But I think acknowledging the feelings that it brings up, probably yes. And the reason I think that is because you and I were having a conversation off camera earlier about why the word alcoholism is so loaded, but it's still a word that I like just for the ism part, because for me, when I think about what's becoming addictive in my life, if I want to characterize it that way, I think of, ISM, the ism I sabotage myself, right? What is it that I'm doing now, whether it be Facebook or work or anything that could look good on the outside, but I'm doing it. It's an ism. I'm doing it compulsively. I know I want to stop. I know I should stop, but I can't seem to stop, and it's hurting me and the people around me. And that can be something as small as Facebook, or it can be something as innocent as exercising all the time.
I love that idea of saying ism as I sabotage myself, and being able to stop and recognize that. That alone is incredibly powerful, being able to stop and recognize that that's what you're doing.
But I don't want to forget, sorry, I should say, because you did ask a question about trauma. So, I mean, I'm not really in the business of kind of classifying traumas, but some people do like to say, small t traumas, big T traumas. I think the point basically is, though, if there's any experience that you weren't able to process at the time, and for some people that can be just being, slightly bullied in school, or it can be never feeling at home in the world, or it can be something as profound as sexual abuse or neglect in childhood. The whole gamut, if it's not acknowledged and shown compassion from yourself and from others, it can become something that literally lives in the body. And this is where Gabor's other books have been so instrumental, like When the Body Says No, etc., because he sort of teaches that very profound thing from both a scientific perspective, but also a sociological and psychological perspective, that these things live in us. And unless we're willing to kind of open up to the experience of feeling them, they don't transform.
And I guess that comes back to the point that he talks a lot in the book about, in order to have an ism, an addiction, your environment's a key part of that. And it may be something quite recent that's happened to you. You talked about an end of a relationship, but, in terms of the things in your life that you think drove you to overwork and to over-exercise, were they big traumas, or were they things that came recently, or were they things that you had to process?
I mean, one, Renee wonderfully said, That whole bit was wonderful. I'd say that there are two things. So childhood trauma occurs, and it doesn't have to be very big, but it can be very damaging to you, right? And trauma isn't what happens to you. It's as in externally. It's what happens inside you. You disconnect from yourself, right? And so you lose part of who you are. And so I would say that trauma can happen very subtly when you're joining the workforce, when you're freshly into marriage. It can start with a shame that you're feeling, but you're not able to acknowledge and process. That just snowballs and snowballs and snowballs, and before you know it, it's become this huge monster, right? So again, it doesn't have to start as a very big event, but and life has a way of just getting complicated, right? If anyone's going to live to 60, life's going to get really tough at least once. And so these things will show up.
Yeah, there's no one there to help you when those things happen. Even the smallest thing can turn out to be colossal in your life because no one was there to witness you in whatever pain it was that you were suffering at the time.
And I think that's what I wanted, that I think is really important to explore. Because for me, I guess I had that very British sense of being a big drinker. I'm from the Ladette generation, so equality was all about downing the pints with the guys. My dad was a big drinker, so it's a family learned behaviour. So drink was automatically going to be my fallback point. And the big problem for me was I ended up in a job I wasn't enjoying. Work for me is a huge part of my identity. I never wanted children. I did politics. That comes with lots of identity with it. And so ending up in a job I wasn't enjoying completely just destroyed my self-esteem in one fell swoop. And so therefore alcohol became the thing that I soothed myself with, and that went up and up and up. And so it wasn't some big thing. It was an actual life stage and a life event that had come to that I had no other skills to deal with, and I had no one to talk to about it. Oh, I've got a job where no one cares if I turn up. Everyone goes, wow, that's amazing. I wish I had that job. No, it makes me feel like I'm a twat. There was no one to talk to. I seemed to have a blessed life, but actually it was destroying my self-esteem, and that's where the big problem came for me.
There's so many people like that, though, that are living this life that on the surface looks wonderful, and then underneath there's this kind of low-grade disenchantment with the whole thing, and often you don't know why, right? It's that sort of nagging feeling that something's not right, but I don't know what's going on.
Yeah,
and that's where maybe you do need to do a bit of digging.
And then we have some, socially acceptable coping mechanisms like alcohol, like going on Facebook or social media, like eating. They're all socially acceptable, even exercising. Do we have some questions from people?
We do.
Cool, excellent. Bring on.
From Rachel, who asks, Laura and everybody else, curious to know what one word or phrase you'd use to describe your feelings after completing the book.
Oh, I'll start. Relieved because it was 15 hours on Audible. But I was really pleased. One word, wasn't it? Oh, shit.
Preferably.
One word.
Phrase, perhaps.
It came together. Some of the things that we do around positive behaviour change, and then the way that Gabor talks about stuff as well, it really helped me encapsulate where the addiction part meets the behaviour change part. Still not one word. Oh well.
Relieved.
Relieved was the word.
Cool. One word that you felt when you finished the book, the first, second, third, or even fourth time.
It sounds really dramatic, but it was just I felt transformed by it. I really did. I felt like my whole mind kind of opened up. But bear in mind, this was a long time ago that I read this, right? And this sort of awareness was barely out there. So for me, it was, intense.
I'd go for connected, right? Everything from, the drug addicts and the stories that we heard through to people that without knowing were actually making life more difficult for people that were addicted.
Connected is really exciting because, like I said, it's really easy to other people whose life circumstances are different to yours. And to be able to bring that back and realise that we all share some similarities of experience is really important. And I really like yours because, you're still here all these years on from first reading it, and this book is still having an impact on your life. And I don't think we should ever underestimate the power of that. The things that I do now with my life, I couldn't do if I was still drinking. I haven't done them all at once. They've taken time. And clearly for you, this book has had such an impact that it's still giving to your life. It's still positively affecting it.
There's about 10 books that I continually tell people to read, and this has always been one of them. And partly it's because I think when you have this sort of awareness, and you've been changed by it, people can tell. And I can't tell you the number of times I've had people come up to me and go like, oh, I think I have sex too much with people in strange places or whatever it is, and then I say, well, there's this great book. Check it out.
Your husband's in the room.
I mean, we are in a strange place now.
What other questions?
We have one other from Vladdy. How do you guys feel about the language we use to describe people struggling with compulsive or addictive tendencies? So words like addict, smackhead, alcoholic, and so on.
I mean, I like them and I don't. I don't like the impact it has in the sense that there's a lot of judgment around it. And I feel like when there's a lot of judgment in a term, people's eyes and ears and hearts just close and they can't have a real conversation. So I love what you're doing because it opens up the space for a larger conversation that more people can identify in the same way that the book did, right? It turned me from someone who was judgmental of addiction to someone who felt great compassion. And I think your work is probably doing the same. I do think we need to change the conversation and use some different words. I don't have any suggestions to do that.
And I'd even say, move away from the targeting the individual and maybe speak more about the context. Yeah. I don't know if it's in this book, but Gabor talks about how you wouldn't blame a plant for growing awkwardly. You would think, were the ingredients there for it to bloom? Yeah. Did it have enough sunlight? Didn't it have enough air? And so I'd probably say that. Let's move away from labeling people and talk more about the context that they were in.
It's interesting because the book made me far happier with the word addict for the first time than I have been. But very much around Club Soda, I've rallied against the word alcoholic, partly because people think it's a medical condition. Am I an alcoholic or not? And that's actually not true. Alcoholic is an identity. That's largely come from AA. And AA comes with it's been around for a long time. So there's lots of things about AA that have seeped in society, which then create judgments back on people. And for the group of people that I feel that I'm part of in changing drinking, they're all quite negative. They're around a disease-based model. I don't have a disease. I have a better life, and not drinking has given me the better life that I want. And for me, that's framing change in a really positive way, whereas alcoholic has always been a negative word in society. And I always still have to start off workshops with, this isn't an AA meeting, because everybody knows in their head what an AA meeting looks like. It's amazing. But you'd speak to people in the States and they're proud of their status as an alcoholic. And actually there's some laws protecting people who are alcoholic in society. So we have this lovely cultural clash. I never use the alcoholic word. I'm alcohol free, because for me that's a far more positive word. And I feel that allows people to then make the change they want. Language is so important to all of this stuff. You can make up your own words if you like. I don't mind. We like the word mindful drinker, and I have people saying, I've unsubscribed from your emails because I've given up drinking. I'm not a mindful drinker. And I tell them, well, no, I'm an alcohol-free mindful drinker in the same way as I'm a bisexual queer. There is a bigger community of which there are different identities within, and the bigger community we are, the more we're likely to make positive change happen.
Final question on Gabor Maté himself, and I know Rich maybe has a story to share as well about his other books. Have you guys looked at any of his other books? Would you recommend any of his other books?
All of them. Yeah, all of them.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Well,
I didn't start with
this.
I think When the Body Says No is a good one.
Yeah, very good.
Scattered Minds. If you know anyone that has ADD, you'll self-diagnose probably with ADD when you read that one, because it's really amazing.
And his latest one that's coming out is talking about culture and how culture keeps us in these ruts.
Which is really important, because actually our society is part of all of that. If I see another apron that says I'm the reason why mummy drinks on it, I'm just going to go mental. Or it would be nice to buy a birthday card that doesn't suggest the only way to deal with aging is to get completely plastered. It'd be really nice, wouldn't it? So, if you don't think culture affects our drinking habits, think again. Rich, have you read the book, new books?
Jump in. Yes, I did. So I've read Scattered Minds because I have ADHD. It is self-diagnosed, so I haven't had an official diagnosis. Thank you. But I did, when I was younger, go to what was called a DDAT clinic, which is Dyslexia, Dyspraxia and Attention Deficit Disorder clinic. And they said I had dyspraxia. And so I did loads of stuff to do with hand-to-eye coordination, and that did cure a lot of things. And so I was like, okay, I'm happy, I'm good. But there's always been exactly the traits that he describes in Scattered Minds. And the real clinch for Scattered Minds for me everybody sees ADHD, attention deficit disorder, as an illness. Again, it comes back to alcoholism. They see it, as AA does kind of describe it, as like a physical, you are allergic to alcohol. And so, or something like that, you'll be able to say much more if you want. But anyway, and he just said, he kind of reframes it, and he always frames things really beautifully. And he says, what do you have? What is order? And then what do you have when you lack order? You have disorder. So in the brain, it's just simply a lack of order, rather than this, again, medical illness. And it does, Scattered Minds is all about how it is medically diagnosed as just a brain chemical thing. You're genetic, you're born with it. Here's some chemicals, the same way depression is dealt with. Here's another chemical to put in your body. Obviously, this is hugely led by the pharmaceutical companies, but he just reframes it in addressing trauma and addressing very beautifully how, when you're a child, if you don't have certain things satisfied as a child from a caregiver, then there are parts of the brain which do not develop. And when those things do not develop, you will grow up with a certain lack of order in certain areas of your brain, and that can lead to ADHD, which has this distractiveness, a lack of organisation skills, very distracted quite easily, as you can see when I'm sitting here kind of going stuff all around my mind. So, yeah, sorry.
I think that actually takes me to a really nice place, because you talk about that love you get as a child, and there's been that mantra all the way through the sort of 60s and 70s, which is, if you treat your child tough, they'll grow up resilient and all of that sort of stuff. And it was all about taking love away from children. And actually, the view is, in so many different therapeutic ways, that actually, what we need is attention and love and all of those things. And I was really interested in this idea of compassionate inquiry. And that's sort of underneath all of the stuff that Gabor talks about. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that? Should we start with you?
Yeah, sure. So compassionate inquiry is Gabor's modality, right? So if you're a therapist or a psychologist, you can study under his tutelage and learn about this methodology. And it's basically a way of helping patients become mindful that they are needing to process something, that something's happening to them, and almost give them that way of being compassionate to themselves by either looking at themselves or at least being able to relate to what they're going through.
And so that's digging into those feelings of shame that you may have, or any of that sort of stuff, and treating yourself kindly, when often when we're doing a behaviour that we're ashamed of, like drinking too much, we punish ourselves. The number of people who fall off the wagon in club soda and go, I can't believe I drank last night, and they suddenly start writing lists of all the ways that they need to be perfect and that they need to take up running and do a diet and give up drinking. They're all actually acts of self-sabotage, and they're all related in shame. And actually what they need to do is go, I'm doing something hard, I drank last night, but what I need to do is be kind to myself and understand what's going on underneath. And I see that time and time again, until people begin to, go, well, I may have drunk last night, but I'm still on the journey. I need to be kind to myself and explore a bit more. Then they don't really get anywhere. And so,
well, that type of self-compassion is really difficult, I think, if you never had it modeled in childhood. And it's certainly not very well modeled in our world either, right? The compassionate stance. It's hard. It's a learned skill. And if you didn't get the message when you were young, you're going to have to learn it in adulthood. And I feel like that's a lot of what the compassion inquiry is about. You'll offer that to others, but you also need to offer it to yourself. And there are some tough bits, there's shame, etc. But I think what you said is really important. If you get to the point where you realize that anything that you do that's bad has a reason, there is an underlying reason why we do the things that we do. We're not just bad, evil people that do wrong things.
And I love the fact that compassionate inquiry is a two-way street, because the reason why I think community is like the superfood of behaviour change is because by helping other people, you are also helping yourself. And Gabor talks a lot about that in his book, that you do the thing that you need yourself as well. And in club soda, you can really see that. And there are people that have been alcohol-free for a long time in club soda and still there, still helping other people. And I think that's really amazing. But sometimes it's just about the small interactions in the here and now.